Hey friends, welcome back to Behind the Mic podcast. If you have ever been betrayed by someone, this episode is for you. Today we're diving into one of the most infamous betrayals in history, the story of Judas Iscariot. I want to share 5 important aspects in this story that I believe will give you a new perspective. We all know the name Judas. It's become synonymous with betrayal. But have you ever stopped to ask, how did he get to that point? Could I ever be like him? And perhaps the hardest question of all, have I ever betrayed Jesus in my own life? Judas wasn't just some villain in a story. He was handpicked by Jesus. He walked with him for years and he saw the miracles up close. And yet, he sold him out for 30 pieces of silver. But here's what I want us to see today. Judas wasn't the only disciple who failed Jesus. Peter denied him. The other disciples abandoned him. So what made Judas's story in the end a tragedy where Peter's ended in redemption? And what does that teach us about our own failures, betrayals, and the grace of Jesus? Stick with me as we unpack this powerful lesson from Judas. Number 1, the tragedy of Judas is a warning for us all. Let's start by setting the scene. Judas Iscariot was one of the 12. He traveled with Jesus. He heard his teachings. He saw firsthand the power of God at work. And yet, somewhere along the way, Judas's heart hardened. John 12 tells us that Judas was the one in charge of the disciples' money bag and that he was stealing from it. In other words, he had a hidden sin long before he ever walked into the Garden of Gethsemane to betray Jesus. Here's the truth. Betrayal doesn't happen overnight. It starts small. A compromise here, a justification there. Judas didn't wake up one day and decide to sell out the Son of God. His heart had been drifting for a long time. That's a warning for us. The little compromises we make, the unchecked sins that we tolerate, the secret places in our hearts where we resist Jesus, those are the cracks where betrayal begins. Secondly, betraying Jesus. How does Jesus handle this? Now, let's talk about Jesus and how he responded. This blows my mind. At the Last Supper, Jesus knew Judas would betray him, and yet he still washed Judas's feet. He still shared a meal with him. And when Judas finally led the soldiers to arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, what did Jesus say? He looked at Judas and he called him friend. Look it up in Matthew 26:50. Think about that. Jesus called the man who was betraying him friend. What does that teach us? When we face betrayal, when someone we trust turns against us, our natural response is anger and bitterness and revenge. But Jesus, he showed grace. Now, that doesn't mean we allow toxic people to continue hurting us and using us, but it does mean that we don't let betrayal turn our hearts bitter. Jesus never lost his love, even for the one who handed him over. Number 3, the spirit of Judas and betrayal in the church. Betrayal isn't something that happened in the Bible. It's something that happens in our church today. Maybe you've experienced it. A leader that you trusted fell into a scandal, or a friend that you confided in turned their back on you. Maybe someone in your church hurt you deeply. Judas walked closely with Jesus, but he still betrayed him. And sadly, the same thing happens today. But here's the danger. When we experience betrayal, we can let it push us away from Jesus. We can start blaming God for what people did. If that's where you are, let me remind you, Judas wasn't a reflection of Jesus' character. And the failures of people today don't change who Jesus is either. We can't let the betrayals of others steal our faith. Number 4, selling out Jesus. Are we any different from Judas? Look, it's easy to shake our heads at Judas, but here's the hard truth. Every time we choose sin over obedience, every time we deny Jesus in our actions, every time we prioritize comfort or money or approval over him, we're not that different. Judas traded Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. What do we trade him for? Do we sell out Jesus for popularity, for success, for relationships, for fear of what people will think? Before we judge Judas too harshly, we need to examine our own hearts. And number 5, the aftermath of betrayal. Judas versus Peter. Now here's where the story takes a turn. Judas wasn't the only one who failed Jesus right that night. Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples, denied him 3 times. He swore up and down he didn't even know Jesus. Both men failed, but their stories ended very differently. Judas was filled with remorse, but instead of running to Jesus, he ran to despair. He tried to undo what he did by throwing the silver back at the priests, but he never sought forgiveness. He let his failure define him, and in the end, he took his own life. Peter, on the other hand, he wept bitterly. But instead of staying in his shame, he eventually ran back to Jesus, and Jesus restored him. Here's the lesson. Failure isn't final if we bring it to Jesus. We will all fail him at some point. We will all have moments where we betray him with our words, or with our choices, or with our silence. But the question is, will we let that failure drive us away from him, or will we run back to the only one who can restore us? So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this. Where is your heart today? Are there small compromises that could be leading you down a dangerous path? Or have you experienced betrayal and you're letting bitterness take root? Have you in some way sold out Jesus for lesser things? Or maybe you failed and now you feel like there's no way back. Here's the good news. No matter how far you have drifted, no matter what you have done, Jesus, he's still calling you back. Judas's story ended in tragedy. Peter's ended in redemption. So which one will yours be? Well, thanks for spending this time with me today. And if this episode challenged you, or if it encouraged you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to Behind the Mic podcast on YouTube, or if you just listen to podcasts, find us on any of your podcast apps so that you don't miss the next episode. Until next time, stay strong, stay faithful, and keep your eyes on Jesus. God bless. Take care.